All right, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, I interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, I hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, narrated, and imagined by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Mukta Naik, is someone whose writing I first came across on Substack, and then I've spent many hours over the last few weeks reviewing her archives on Substack and her wonderful blog, Ramblings in the City, which she has been writing since 2011. A little bit about Mukta before we jump into this conversation. So, Mukta is a Gurgaon based researcher who investigates urban informality, housing, and migration. She makes meaning of her multifaceted life through her writing practice, which she holds dear to her heart. She trained as an architect and urban planner. Her work experience spans research, policy, advisory, advocacy, and participatory design. She has worked with diverse stakeholders and also taught in university programs. So, Mukta, we have a short amount of time, and there's so much I want to ask you because I've been fortunate to, experience your work. And this is the first time we're speaking, but it almost seems like I know you because of what you've written and shared on the internet for so long. So, the first question I wanted to ask you, Mukta, is because you are someone that studies cities, really closely. So, can you tell me about how your relationship with cities has evolved over time, based on the cities that you've stayed in over time?
Sure. Thanks, Abhishek. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. And it's the first time I'm actually doing something like this. So, which is more focused on my writing than, on my professional work or rather coming from someone who's first read my writing and then known about my professional work. So this is exciting. I'm a city girl. My early years were in Bombay and then later in Lucknow. And then I came to Delhi to do my undergraduate in architecture, and I've been in the NCR save for 2 years since. So it's been a long association with large and multifaceted cities, and it's not a wonder that I ended up studying about cities and thinking about cities and working on cities as I went along in my career. I think cities are very exciting spaces for a lot of people. They're also spaces that allow you to be you, in the sense an escape from the confines of your family. But for others, they're also very hostile spaces. So there's no one narrative you can tell about cities because of their complexity. So that's really what fascinates me. How do you peel and uncover the complex layers of a space that you live in, you work in, you care about, but you also spend your time studying.
For sure. And, we're talking from two premier cities in the country of India. And, it's right now I can hear voices of cars going by, and there are challenges and benefits of living in big cities. And I'd love to unpack some of that. And what I will do is I will include some of your research in the show notes because this is a very small amount of time to unpack all the research you've done over such a long time. But I wanted to go back to your childhood, Mukta, growing up in Bombay. And I read a post recently where you put up photos of your dad working in a hospital in Mumbai, which I thought was so wonderful to review and read. So, what was Mukta like growing up? What were you interested in at school and outside school? And what were some of the other influences in your life apart from that?
So I did my primary schooling in Bombay, and my parents worked in the KM hospital in Parel. So this was a really, in the heart of the city, and it was such a safe city that even though we lived on campus, we were able to just wander around and walk around the city, cross busy roads, even as 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds, and kind of be city urchins, so to speak. I remember catching public transport to school if I missed the school bus, and nobody would bat an eyelid at home. And school was in Badala, and it was literally located in a sea of informal settlements and slums that didn't seem to bother anyone at that time. And then later, my secondary schooling, high school, was in Lucknow, which is a very, very different context. Um, I was in school. I was really interested in the academic part of school. I mean, being a good student was a big part of my personality. I went to convent schools most of my school life, so being the good girl was also, I think, a very important part of my personality. But I learned music from a very young age. So music and dance have been a very big part of my life and also woven into school life. So I guess in those days used to call them all-rounder students, or students who were sort of shoved into various things with teachers having reasonable amount of confidence that they'd perform to the best of their ability. So I was sort of that person in school. I've changed a lot since, but in school I was very much the go-getter who wanted to be in the middle of everything and wanted to do a little bit of everything, and also try and excel at most things I did. Of course, some things I did at and some things I wasn't so good at, but that was the vibe then.
Then I remember reading one of the descriptions, I think in your blog, where you spoke about how being an artist is such an important part of your identity, and it's not just your work as an urban researcher. So I'd love to explore that a little bit today too. But where did the seed for architecture and first come up? Because as a teacher myself, I'm always curious about why students make certain decisions. And you studied architecture for 5 years from 94 to 99. So why did you decide to do that, and what was your experience in that program?
So it was the most banal of decisions. Like many people in my generation, you arrived at a career through elimination and not really through choice. So my parents were both doctors, and I was very set on not becoming a doctor. I have no idea why, but it seemed like maybe it was just teenage rebellion or whatever. But and I really didn't have the mathematical genius to go into engineering or a really math oriented profession. And I thought architecture was a good mix of having a science oriented education in high school, but yet having enough room to explore other sides of myself. And I already knew by then that I had an artistic side that needed some space. So I think it was instinct. I can articulate these things today. I couldn't have articulated it the same way when I was 18. But that was the instinct broadly, elimination, and then a sort of sense that maybe this is the college environment that I may be able to fit into better than in engineering or a more technical environment.
Makes sense. And how is an architecture program structured, Mukta? What do you learn in that 5 year period? Because that's a very long period of time. And what are some of the skills you gain at the end of that program?
Yeah, so the studio is really at the heart of an architecture program. So it's a studio format in which students are given a real life problem. Initial years are more generic design issues, and then as you progress, they become more complex architectural problems. So you may start with your own room, and then to a home, and then to a hotel, and then a housing complex, and maybe even part of a city. So the complexity increases, but you do it in a studio where you develop concepts and then you flesh out the design, all the while being guided by your teachers and also your peers. So it's a actually highly socially interactive way of learning. We also then had ancillary subjects to support us theoretically, whether it was history of architecture or technical stuff like plumbing, lighting, building construction, things like that. So, but the heart of the program is really the studio where you explore your ideas and get a lot of critical feedback. And I think the big thing in architecture college is that you learn to receive critical feedback
Hmm.
and take it on board. And that's really something that I'll hold dear. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I remember listening to another architect. I think it was a podcast with an architect by the name of Zaha Hadid, who's considered a prominent architect, and she said that like so many of her designs didn't go through, and she had this vision for by the end of her career to have a majority of her work seen in the world, but it was a very small percentage of what she created that actually came to life by the end of her career. So right after you finished your undergraduate program, you explored like a master's program. And, I'm wondering if you were suddenly moving from the individual to the social in this sort of space where you were also interacting with public policy, with how these individual designs coexist in a city space, in a social space. So what was your experience in that program like?
So actually, I knew by third year of architecture that this is not this is not what I'm going to do, because I was really fascinated by the larger scale, by the city rather than by the individual's house or the individual building. So the master's program, which I actually pursued in the US, first of all, just being educated in the American system was fascinating, because it I think gave me a lot of autonomy to choose subjects, and a much more broad choices and interaction across different kinds of folks and teachers also who came from different backgrounds. But the planning education is really a mix of law. There's not that much design in it. It's more about rules and laws and what a city will allow people to do, what it will not allow people to do. But even there were two tracks that really fascinated me. First was the historic preservation track, which is basically coming from, architecture and my love for cultural and old things. And it was really interesting to see how a planner would actually think about the historic parts of the city. And the second, which is something that still holds sort of at the core of what I do today, is the community development track. So I think the potential for a planner or a planning as a discipline to improve lives of those who are born into poor and vulnerable circumstances was something that caught my fancy right at the outset. So that was the certification that I did during my planning course, and that's really what shaped my career choices since then.
That's really interesting, Mukta, because you had this solid grounding in architecture and urban planning, and more since 2010. You've been working not only as an urban planner, but then since 2014 you decided to move into the policy space. I'm just curious about the idea of your blog, and I know there are 800 plus posts in your older blog, and on Substack you've been writing really actively now as a 2.0 version of that blog. But what was the idea behind rambling in the city, and where did that come from?
So I think I really enjoyed the practice part of my work, like just working on the ground, whether it was folks building housing and you were thinking through some of the community aspects of it or the planning aspects of it, or, mostly I worked in housing in the initial years. And the move into research was also really because I always came back with more questions than I gave people answers for. So it seemed like, people were asking us for answers on how to build better or how to improve their lives. And you always came away with more questions and frustrations. And there was really no space to really explore that. But also, I think I discovered myself as a political being in those early years of my career. So I worked across a number of different segments. I worked for a little bit in an organization that worked on standardization and on actually bringing manufacturers of construction products together to standardize, to train people better. So there was a lot of these questions of what is public good, in the sense that what are the things we need to do to make things better for everyone, that I was exploring in all of my work roles, whether it was working with the industry or later as an entrepreneur or later, or even then after that as a policy researcher. That sort of was the core question, that, yeah, we can do a lot of things to advance our own careers, but what are the knowledge outputs that we need to advance a lot of people's lives, alongside? That really became the question. And the blog came from a little bit of a desire to I always was writing, but it was writing for myself. In the early years of my career, I dabbled with writing newspaper articles, and as an architect planner, uh, newspapers were always happy to have opinion pieces on, road infrastructure or flooding or things like that. It was a lot easier then for a young professional like me to be placed into, to get space in a media outlet. I think it wasn't that competitive a space then. But then I realized that it's very restrictive. You have to have a hook, which everyone is interested in. It has to sort of play to the gallery a little bit, and I needed a space where I didn't have to do that. And that's how Rambling in the City was born. And then it just became my playground for doing anything I wanted. In 2012, I think I was at a career crossroads, really trying to decide what to do next. And I had been running a business in which I had wandered a little bit away from the domain of urban planning, and I was trying to find a way back. And I set myself this goal of writing every day. So in 2012, there are 365 posts for 365 days for precisely this reason, that I wanted to see if a writing practice can actually help you write better. What would you write if you had to write every day to the public, not just for yourself? And it was a really interesting experience, because in the beginning I was spending 2 hours trying to churn out something that sounded very intelligent, and then soon I realized, nobody's looking for intelligence, they're just looking for you. They just want a slice of your life. They're really not looking for gyan. They're not looking for something very over analyzed and packaged. So I eased into a very different writing persona by the end of that year, and I think that's where I stuck. It became a lot easier
Uh,
to
you know,
write.
yeah, just hearing you, and I remember that piece you wrote about the struggles of the academic writer. And I'm curious about how you navigate both these spaces on your blog and in a professional capacity, and your relationship with writing. Because when I look at your blog, it seems so much more free flowing. There's a section for field notes, there's a section for what you're observing on your trips and travel. And then I also got to read some of your policy papers where you have to structure it around a particular thesis, and work with another group of researchers or an organization. So do you feel like a tension between these two spaces, or you feel like they mingle in interesting ways?
Um, I think you just learn by experience. When I started working in the policy research space, I actually had no experience with academic writing. The institution I worked with had an academic bent of mind. So we were sort of encouraged to also write academically, though it wasn't necessary. And I think to be known as someone who had an expertise in a certain field was important to me personally. Later in 2018, I started a PhD journey, which then I completed only last year. But after I had cut my teeth and realized that academic writing is also something that I can do if I put my mind to it. And it's just about which circles you want your knowledge to circulate in.
Mm.
One thing is writing for yourself, one thing is writing for a closed set of people who follow your blog or read your Substack. But it's a totally different thing to say, I have done research and I actually know with decent amount of confidence and decent amount of authority about something, and so I need to write in those spaces where people would take me seriously. And learning academic writing was a journey of its own. It was a parallel journey. I had excellent mentors. I had peers who would read drafts, trash them. So it was architecture school all over again, but in a totally different context. And that was actually completely parallel to my personal writing space
Mm.
now. And the space that you allude to, when I write to an audience that is struggling to write, now at 49, I can think back and understand that those parallel journeys were actually not parallel, and that they actually intersected. At the time, they seemed like completely parallel and separate exercises.
Mm. Yeah, and like whenever I have friends, that pursue a PhD program, I always wonder, how do they stay so persistent, with a particular topic, and the feedback cycle, you have to be really open to that. So for your PhD program, if you could help me understand what you studied and what your findings were,
Yeah.
and also speaking to someone that maybe doesn't know enough about the field, I'm curious, like not only what you researched about, but what were some of the personal challenges and personal joys through that journey for you as a researcher in that point in your life?
So I started my PhD in my early 40s and finished it in my late 40s. So it's not a typical time for someone to do a PhD. And a lot of people ask me why I'm doing it at all. And it was some sort of a personal quest. But essentially, I had got very interested in the situation of migrants in India, through my work on housing initially, and then through my work on livelihoods and planning. And so essentially, and the other thread was that I thought that urban scholarship was too focused on the Mumbais and Delhis of the country, and that there's just so many other cities which are smaller, tucked away in different corners of the country, that don't really get much attention. So I combined these two interests to look at who are the young migrants in smaller cities, and what do they do, what are the labor market conditions, and basically how do they navigate life in the city. And the recommendations that I came up with were really to look at if we look at the city from a non-metropolitan lens and we sort of expand our ambit of what a city might be, mm, then how do we appreciate what mobility brings, as in how migration brings talent to cities and how we should treat that talent and how cities can benefit from it. So it really was about young people in cities and what they do and the differences between men and women, the differences between people born in different social categories of caste or of, economic class, and how social capital, who all of these things actually matter in a city as much as they may have mattered back in a village. So this is the sort of story that I tell about two cities, one in Rajasthan and one in Karnataka. Those were my case sites, and I sort of take people through a journey of different kinds of young people and their trajectories, and eventually giving recommendations for how cities could look look at this issue and maybe use their workforce better, and also be more inclusive, towards migrants.
And like in terms of research, Mukta, like um, again, like I remember reading something that you wrote where you spoke about how researchers within the country and researchers that maybe get an education outside or have a research lab in another country, whose voices are heard and how are they, put forward. You did mention that that can be a struggle for people that maybe are researching a topic in a local context and don't have the funds and resources. So do you feel like there's a reason that we primarily study the larger metros of the country and we don't study the others, or there's a reason we are primarily biased towards researchers from particular labs, particular places of the world? Is there like a politics in that too?
Absolutely. I mean, knowledge is power, and knowledge travels through power and power circuits, and that's also why we have, even in our education, still a lot of Western sources and influences. Not to say that they shouldn't be, but also that we must have much wider exposure. And this is also sort of coming from, the conversations around subaltern writing or now Dalit literature, and there are, of course, questions of appropriation and questions of who should be speaking for whom, that are important, and we must think about them. And in that context, I've had the chance to teach in multiple universities. I've never held a permanent teaching position, but that has also given me the freedom to dabble in different kinds of institutions. And there's a marked difference between teaching in a public university versus in a private university because of just the diversity of minds that you meet as a teacher in a public university. And what it taught me is that brilliance does not come from money and class and exposure. Brilliance is often innate and embedded, and somebody who hasn't had much exposure but has the ability to think and analyze can actually have brilliant insights. And this was a real revelation for me because I'm an English speaking. I mean, I grew up speaking English because my parents are from different parts of the country. I'm as entitled as they come, convent school education, Western exposure, and all of that. And I actually ended being in a position where I was learning from students who came from the most ordinary backgrounds, who had struggled to even get into get a position as a PhD scholar or as a master's student in a public university, has probably struggled and fought with his family for the means to come and study there. And there was no difference, there was no inherent advantage that folks like me had over these people. But English is a huge barrier. The confidence to express themselves in a language that's alien to them is a huge barrier. And unfortunately, we live in a world in which you do need to be able to do that to be taken seriously or even to reach a wider audience. So that's, I mean, if I was a linguist and if I had the talent to learn many languages, maybe I would have, you know, also wanted to work on how people can use their own native languages to express their ideas more powerfully. And I wish we had, more encouragement and funding for that. But what I can do is perhaps, help people who don't have English as a first language write better. So that's really where this was coming from. And even with my students, it would be really fun to, use visual mediums, ask them to speak about their thoughts, and then record what they were themselves saying, and then turn it into writing, and then see if their peers could help them with editing and polishing it. So many sort of creative ways to help non-English speakers, but who have very, very, good thoughts and very refined thinking, to be able to compete in a space that seems to be more, seems to be dictated by how well you can conduct yourself in an English speaking environment.
Yeah, and like that got me thinking about how research is also conducted, about the idea of sample sizes and what is being studied, and does the sample represent the whole that is actually being studied. And with a country like India, for instance, for people studying something so diverse and so beautifully different in so many ways, like in every state you have different languages, different cultures, different ways of being. Like as you said, I'm curious about, like, in your journey as a researcher, did you notice some creative ways to conduct research that were uh, slightly different from what you would normally consider as good academic research, but that gave you insights that you thought were really different and important in the long term?
So I was fortunate to work in environments in which we had research colleagues who had different kind of competencies.
Hmm.
Personally, I'm very drawn towards qualitative research.
Hmm.
So I think it's important to have what you were saying, quantitative research, which actually, gives you the confidence to say that we can say that this is generally true because we have, surveyed, or we have a sample that is representative. But to really deeply understand the issues, one has to complement that with qualitative ways of doing things. So it's a little bit of a back and forth between both the methods. But beyond that, even within qualitative research, I mean, I've learned a lot from action research projects. So for instance, not even formal research projects, but if you're affiliated with, say, an NGO that's been working in a particular community for a very long time, and you can uh, influence the NGO or encourage them or teach them some basic research skills to establish baselines and endlines on what their impact is, that could really help them tell a very powerful story about how change has happened or how something has failed, how an intervention has not achieved what it is what it was purported to achieve. So it's also about storytelling, right? I mean, research is not, it's not something that should sit inside a journal or inside a book that nobody reads. It should eventually become a story that many people can understand. So the rigor, without sacrificing the rigor, if we can tell that story. Another project that was really fascinating, I was in fact telling my colleagues about it today, was a project in which we were able to give a small group of women mobile phones and give them some basic training on it. They'd never had smartphones before, and then we just put them into WhatsApp groups with young researchers. So the senior folks actually recused themselves from these groups so that they didn't feel intimidated by our presence. And these researchers would just place gentle nudges in those groups, and people would share things and just see the diverse ways in which people were using these mobile phones, from being able to improve social relations with the extended family and therefore build social capital in an intra household context, to using it to become a leader of a union or strengthen their leadership capabilities in a union, and therefore actually be able to help women, say, protect themselves from intimate partner violence, or go to an employer and ask for wages that weren't paid, so really, like, the hard stuff. And it was just the phone that did that, and doing that was just, it was a research exercise, but it also gave you an insight into people's lives. And my research assistants would sort of analyze all the things that were shared and give them to me in a processed form. So I wouldn't actually read the actual conversations, and that kept their identity and their private lives a little protected. And what we put out was a more analyzed version of what the trends were, what the patterns were, maybe use a few quotes, and again use storytelling to be able to tell a larger story about how digital technology can transform the lives of women if and if the access were eased. So these are the kind of ways in which I think research can, you know, touch our lives in so many ways, but we don't often start thinking of research as something that happens elsewhere and is done by other people, and is not really connected to problems that we all think about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of bringing research to life by adding those elements of being a little more qualitative, but not losing that rigor. I think that balance is so important. And sometimes, like as citizens, we forget that a lot of research is useful to us in so many different ways. And it's also our responsibility within the cities that we live in to understand what is happening, understand how we can improve our cities. Because as taxpayers, we have a stake in the system as much as the policymakers do. So I I really love that point. But as a researcher, when you're reading research, Mukta, I know you publish a lot of research, but they often say a writer is also very often a very critical reader too. So when you are reading research, not just in India, but in a global context, were there like um, particular programs or research programs or maybe research studies or ways of studying cities that you were quite intrigued by and that you think could be applied in our context too?
um in planning school, the education we got was really pragmatic. And so I think master's level education should be also. So, more than the research skills that we got at that time were really like simple tools. But what's really influenced my thinking over time is a group of researchers here in India and in other parts of the global south that have really focused on place, in the sense that oftentimes research is thought of as, we think of things in abstraction, and this is coming from the sciences where you think of a method or you think of a hypothesis, and it's usually an abstraction, and then you go and do experimental stuff. You go into the field and you conduct experiments, and that's how you then decide whether your hypothesis was true or false, or nuance it in whatever way. But in the social sciences, I've learned that that's not necessarily a way to go about it. You can actually do the reverse, where you embed yourself in your environment, observe very keenly, and end with an abstraction. You may not actually start with an abstraction or a hypothesis at all.
Hmm.
I think frees us up from the pressure of always having to have a hypothesis when we go into the field, or when even as ordinary citizens. Um, when we navigate lives, I mean, all of us are researchers. We're also researching, and you don't have to be trained in research to be doing research. You're doing it anyway. Something as simple as deciding whether the wages you pay to your domestic help are the right wages is research that most households are doing every day, right? So for me, this insight that you can actually start from the bottom and then work yourself up into theory was really empowering. And I think that's something I try to teach my students too. Don't get too intimidated by what everybody has said about a lot of important things. While it's important to read all that, it's also just important to trust your own instincts, and then learn the methods along the way. The methods that suit your inquiry is what I'm basically trying to say.
I love that because that gives you more freedom to be open about the impact or the outcome you're looking for. I feel like I think that's the freedom of doing like a long-term study in the social sciences where you don't immediately have to define that outcome. And I feel like you may find something that you weren't looking for at the start as well. And that is also in its own way challenging, but also important for the work that you do.
It's
I
also a lifelong learning, right? I mean, this is what I would say to an undergraduate student or to a first year master's student. But if I was reading the work of an established researcher, then I would, to answer your question about being critical, put on a much more critical lens, where I would say, hey, by now you should have figured out what your questions are, what you really want to know, how you want to research them. You should have figured out what the ethical way to do research is, what a rigorous way to do research is. So it's also about where you are in that journey. And to an earlier point, for ordinary citizens, for all of us who live in cities and read a lot of stuff, a lot of the writing, especially the early years of rambling in the city, the blog, also came from this thing about what is being written about our cities in newspapers or in popular sort of media, and who's writing that, who's really controlling that discourse. And to me it seemed very technocratic a lot of the time. It's really somebody's already decided this is a discourse, this is the direction that we want to channel it in, and then they're writing to that direction. So it's very pre-planned sometimes, whereas actually people should be reading a variety of sources, a variety of voices. So it's also that, that can we bring the city into the, and since I started, since the 2011 2012 phase, now you see a lot more urban, so-called urban content in everything that we read, because so many of us now understand that our urban living environments have something to do with how we think, how we perceive problems, that living in a dense city, dealing with a certain kind of urban stress, anxiety, shapes our mind in certain way. That awareness wasn't there, I think, earlier, but now it's building, and I see a lot of people who may not be urbanists as such, weaving the uh, urban situation or the urban experience into their writing.
Yeah, and like even with the proliferation of new media and social media, since the 2010s, and I think that's the phase where you also started writing more actively. I remember asking a friend, because we stay in Mumbai, what are your thoughts on the city? And he had an answer that was very different from my own. And then I started thinking that my own answer has changed today than from maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And I thought that these were all data points about what a city means. Does the idea of a city only constitute the vision of the urban planners, or does it include every single citizen that lives in that and their combined vision of it? And just this notion of stories and statistics, some people would share stories, some people would tell me statistics about the number of bridges that have come up since like the last 6 or 7 years. So this notion of stories and statistics, qualitative, quantitative, if you could help me understand how you wrote some, and I just wanted to move into your journey as a writer, Mukta, like if you could break down 2 or 3 pieces that you wrote by looking at how you brought these stories and statistics to life, and just tell me about your process of how you create these posts. I'm just curious because I see a lot of nuance and detail there too.
So I think I have two distinct processes of writing. The first one is very instinctive, where an idea strikes me or something bothers me about something somebody said, just like you were saying, you make an observation and then you sort of just stream of consciousness, write it out in one go, and then you come back to it a couple of days later and say, hey, if someone were reading it who doesn't live in my mind, would this make sense to them? And then you edit for an external audience. So these posts are usually more free flowing. Of late, my writing has also moved from this more, I'm writing for everyone to make sense of a particular issue, to I'm writing to make sense of myself. I mean, there's no, I think the filters have started to come off in recent times. And that's also like age, where you are in life. I mean, all these things matter. And I remember I used to think a lot more in 2015 and 16 about how my writing would be consumed and perceived than I do today.
Mm,
Today I'm confident and I don't really think much about that. So the second process is where you're trying to make a point. So when you're trying to make a point that this is what I want, I know this is what I want the reader to walk away with, then I would have, like, these are the three big points I want to say, and some of those points can be supported by statistics and numbers, some can't, some require more anecdotal information. I'm not really a numbers person. It's not instinctive for me to reach out for numbers, but there are just certain things that need numbers to, offer impact. And this is something I struggle with in my work as well. So I really work well when I work closely with a colleague who's a very number oriented person. So that combination works well, because I know the story, but I'm not very good at finding the numbers that tell the story, that make the story more impactful. That's not my talent, and I'm pretty aware of that. So even when I do my personal writing, you'll find that there's a lot less quantitative information in it. But when I do professional writing, then I do have that, because I have help and I have databases and professional support to make the numbers happen. And also that when you work in the policy space, you're also convincing a very different set of people. You're not writing for a generic audience, you're writing for a policy audience who require a lot. They have a much higher threshold of what they demand from you in terms of verification and factual content. What they call evidence base has to be pretty clear. So it really depends on what kind of writing you're doing. If you're doing a policy memo, if I'm doing a policy memo, then I'll go and find the numbers I need. What I've learned over the years is that finding credible numbers is really important. So the sources have to be really credible. You don't just cite any report that you find through a Google search. You do a little digging. Who's written the report? Why have they written it? Are they coming from a very preconceived position? Do you agree with that position? Is that position ethically comfortable to what you are writing? So there are lots of questions that you need to write even before you just pick a number off the internet and put in your blog or in your newspaper piece. So you learn over years to back certain data sets, and these are things that are safe, that I know I can rely on. These are maybe stripped of the bias, whereas these sources are biased in these ways, and so I need to pick them carefully. So that's something, as a person who's not a numbers person, I've now have a system by which I can make those choices. But you need to make that system for yourself and where your comfort levels lie.
Wonderful. And in terms of recommendations, Mukta, like, can you give me some book, film, art recommendations that have stayed with you? It's a small amount of time, but anything that comes to your mind now.
So, from a reading perspective, I actually read more fiction than non-fiction, even though my work is all about policy. So, I mean, I go back to Agatha Christie all the time. I go back to, Woodhouse and things that I grew up with all the time. In a recent Substack post, I even referred to Enid Blyton, though I don't think I would be able to read Blyton again. I'm actually really excited by the OTT content that we see nowadays. I just finished seeing Black Warrant, which is on Bihar. So, I mean, the social commentary in some of these shows, I think, can do a lot that writing can't do, because it's difficult for people to engage with the written word. So I'm really glad that there are sensitive folks making these kind of shows and putting these things out there. And when it comes to propaganda, I think writing can be propaganda too. Visual medium can also be propaganda. So again, putting on your lenses and figuring out how you consume something is also the responsible thing to do. So I'm very critical about the content I watch too. So that's the latest that I would recommend, the show.
Wonderful, Mukta. And for someone that's curious about your work on the internet, if they want to follow this conversation up and reach out to you or learn more about your work or read more of your work, how can we find your writing on the internet?
So I'm on Substack. Rambling in the City is on Substack. My academic writing is on Academia. You can find it through Google Scholar as well, if you just type up my name. Unfortunately, a lot of academic writing is behind paywalls, but if you drop me a line through Academia, I can send you the paper if you need to read it. Yeah.
Thanks, Mukta. Thank you so much for your time. And on that note, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories. I highly recommend Mukta's Substack. And it's got me curious about the way I relate to the city I stay in. But I don't think it's just about cities. I think it's about so much more. There's wonderful book recommendations. And I also I really enjoyed how you were speaking about your relationship to writing and how that's evolved over time. So it's also helping me reflect on my relationship with writing, Mukta. So thank you so much. And until next time, for the listeners tuning in, keep learning.